Hello and welcome to those viewing on Facebook to Bendigo SDA Live. And to those viewing on YouTube, welcome to Biblical Paradigm. And for those viewing on Twitch, welcome back to the Pastor Daniel 2 Twitch channel. Apologies to those on Twitch that we haven't streamed in quite a number of weeks there because we haven't been able to have interaction. There have been more church services. This today is a more relaxed discussion. And I've got a special guest today who's going to talk with us about some of the legislation that is going through or being proposed in the government here in Australia and Victoria. So this maybe you don't live in Australia, you may think it's not relevant to you, but actually, from what I've seen, things that happen in Australia often end up happening elsewhere in the world later on, and things that happen in Victoria often end up happening across Australia. So this is relevant to everybody. This is a discussion about freedom, a discussion about how that may relate to religion, and a discussion about what we might end up doing to be sent to prison. This is something that is not new for us as Christians, but I'm actually joined by someone who is happy to admit and to say that he has been to prison himself. And I'm going to introduce now Jordan Dittloff. Jordan is from the Liberal Democrat Party, and he's been very kind to share some of his time with me on his day off to be able to talk about these things, religious freedom, and it's something that's very important to you, isn't it, Jordan?
It is, Daniel, thank you. And I think I'd probably take issue, as would anyone who knows me, with the idea that I ever have days off. I'm a serial overcommitter and seeker out and destroyer of my free time, but I'm thrilled to join you, and I would certainly agree with your characterization of the events that are unfolding in Victoria and in Australia more broadly for the relationship between the state and religion going forward.
So this is, you mentioned the state and religion, and maybe we've heard before of the term separation of church and state. Maybe that's something that we'll be repeating over and over again. So let me just say about that term that it's a term that's rooted in Christianity. It's rooted in the Bible. It's rooted especially in the Protestant tradition, which I'm a part of, and many of us watching here are a part of. That the idea that our religion is something that the government should not have governance over, and that the church, in its turn, should not be dictating to the government how they should govern. It's a delicate balance.
Render unto Caesar and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. Jesus himself, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And Jesus also said, my kingdom is not of this world. Look, John, I want to focus on some of the things that, first of all, a little background about yourself, but also some of the things that are going on at the moment in Victoria. I want to keep it to an hour, so, we're not going to be able to cover everything. And I hope that in the future we may be able to have another live stream again. Also, for anyone watching that, is wondering what is the Liberal Democrat Party and why have I invited you guys? Well, I've actually invited the local Labor MP as well, and also a Liberal senator from my area. So, I'm happy to have them on as well, but they haven't responded yet. So I'm hoping that maybe they will. But in the meantime, I've got Jordan here. So if you've got any questions for him, maybe Jordan, can you just tell us, first of all, Liberal Democrat Party, is that the Liberal Party? What's that?
No, although I think the Liberal Party would like to suggest that people would get confused. I think that happens far less often than they claim. The Liberal Democrats is a minor party in federal and state politics here in Australia, minor in parliamentary numbers only. I don't think minor describes the importance of the party's beliefs or the uniqueness in many respects of what the party's platform advocates. Libertarianism has traditionally been viewed with mixed feelings, I think it's fair to say, perhaps by people of faith. I think often the idea that individual freedoms would be emphasized over the good of the community or over the obligations that we owe one another can sometimes be an uncomfortable one for people of faith. But I think some of those perceived tensions really stem from misinformation spread by the political opponents of libertarianism. And in fact, the founding fathers of modern libertarian thought, such as John Locke, Mills, and many others, were people of faith. And really what they sought to enshrine was not just individual freedoms and rights, as the language of modern rights tends to speak of, but duties and obligations voluntarily entered into by people on behalf of others and in society. So the volunteer ethic, the freedom of people to believe whatever they choose to believe within their own spheres, so long as it's not forcing those beliefs on other people. I think there's many areas in which libertarianism and faith not only can coexist, but have a common sort of tradition and lineage in many respects. But in terms of the Liberal Democrats here and now, the Liberal Democrats have two members of Parliament in the Legislative Council, the upper house of the Victorian Parliament, and those two parliamentarians, David Limbrick and Tim Quilty, have consistently voted against extensions of government emergency powers. They have consistently stood by their principles and advocated on behalf of some unpopular opinions around what measures should or shouldn't be justified in response to the threat. Indeed, they're probably the only parliamentarians in Australia over the last few years who have asked for the threat posed by COVID to be quantified at all and measured. And that, I think, in itself should be a source of concern for anyone listening to this podcast, that so few people are asking, why are we embarking on this, gigantic endeavor? Why are we so afraid of any harm, or indeed our own mortality, that we will essentially throw away so much else to preserve the fact of life rather than quality of life or freedom?
So freedom is a big word for me. Like, I think, as for our church, freedom is something that we put on a very high level. We believe that God himself gives people the freedom to choose. And that's not something that I think every Christian would be comfortable with, but that's what we believe, that love cannot force. So let me, so thank you for telling us a little about your political background, but you've told us some things about your personal background as well that I think are interesting, are unusual. And I say unusual, they probably shouldn't be unusual, but I don't want to go into how you ended up there, but you mentioned that you spent a bit of time in prison. Could you tell me a little about that? And what I'm particularly wanting to ask is, how does it feel like to be sentenced to prison for 2 years?
Well, I would say that the answer to that question depends very much on what you're there for. In my case, 2 years felt like an appropriate punishment for things I had done wrong. I had a small business that unfortunately failed due to my inexperience and lack of business management skills at the time. I bought a business when I was 21, and nobody at 21 really has any business owning a business. And through a result of that inexperience, and also struggling with addiction and drug abuse, essentially, I did find myself doing things and behaving in a way that really fell short of not only the values of society, but my own personal standards and values as someone who does subscribe to libertarianism. So I think for me, prison was a redemptive experience. I think the idea of penance is one that penance and redeeming oneself through action and reflection. I think that's a very Christian ethic that I think many of your listeners could understand. I think learning to forgive myself for the things I'd done wrong was the first step in my path towards making amends and growing as a person. So to answer your question directly, for me, very quickly after going to prison, I felt like it was the best thing that could have happened to me, and it probably saved my life. Having said that, if you were in prison for something that you believed, or you were putting your own values into action in a way that you were being true to yourself and you were behaving in a way that you didn't believe to be morally wrong, but society disagreed, then I suspect it would be potentially quite a different experience.
Yeah. I just, when you tell me that experience, that you felt that it was just and you felt that it was redemptive. It reminds me of there's a story, but I don't know if you've heard the story, but when Jesus was on the cross, there were two men crucified next to him. You heard this?
Barabbas, yeah.
Right. Well, Barabbas was guilty, and Jesus he was meant to be the one in the middle there. But there were two on either side, and one of those two said to Jesus, "Oh, if you're such a big shot, why don't you save us all? Why don't you, change this situation and get us out of trouble?" Right. But the other one, after initially, joining in a bit, had a change of heart, and he said, "Actually, no, we're the ones who deserve this, and this guy's done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And so in a way, he was the very first person that Jesus actually said, "Yes, you have salvation." And that he was, Jesus was converting this man on the cross because he was able to see that he was guilty and that this was something that he deserved. Now, I don't know, we would question whether anyone deserves that kind of punishment, but that sense of
the Romans certainly believed that was the case, and I think that's probably a salutary warning as to what society believes is acceptable and what governments feel justified in doing has changed a lot over time, and not always for the better. And I'd suggest these things, while they're not cyclic and history doesn't repeat itself, it often echoes. And I think we have to really be conscious of knowing what can happen and what human nature and of course governments are nothing but an extension of human nature is capable of, and that there's no inherent morality in the state.
Yeah. So, you're in good company. If you are willing to acknowledge that you did wrong and that your punishment actually was something that was helping you, then, I think that's a place where, we can all use a bit of that humility and a bit of that.
It gives me great strength in my life now, because I am, more than happy to wear my past on my sleeve, because I can reconcile it and I can understand and explain how the mistakes I made have informed who I am now, and how the lessons I learned from that can help me not only to be a better person in myself, but to help others and to be a leader in the community in these areas. I was in a drug and alcohol program at Beechworth Correctional Centre, which was an open camp prison. I spent quite a bit of time in northeastern Victoria, and the person who was taking that program said something that was the first time I'd ever heard that said since coming to prison. And he said, "You guys can go back and be leaders in your community in this area." And that was something that it probably rocked me to my core a little bit, because I really was still being very hard on myself. I was really reconciling myself to a life of small goals and of negative onus, of not reoffending and all that sort of thing. And that was the first time that I ever heard a message of hope, that my experiences could be of use to other people and could benefit other people struggling with the same experiences that I had been through. So I think that was really powerful. That was a very pivotal moment that I'll always remember that.
Right. Yeah. So I have another related question, and that is, what would I need to do to go to prison for 2 years under the Victorian government's Change or Suppression Prohibition Act?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think my discussion of the change and suppression, whatever the name they've essentially given it to mask its nature. I think theoretically, any of the offences that are set out in the Act could carry the maximum penalty of up to 2 years. In the case of engaging in suppression practices, so-called, that cause injury, so as in that actually cause injury, it's actually up to a level 5 imprisonment, which is 10 years. So many of the offences created.
Injury. What would be an actual injury?
Well, the Act
actually, like if you actually paralyze somebody from shock treatments or something.
No. So they actually, within the Act, define serious injury very broadly as well. They do define serious injury as incorporating mental distress and psychological trauma and whatever else. They do define those things very broadly, consistently with the definition found in the Crimes Act, and every indication from the explanatory memoranda and the way that this legislation has been drafted is that the Equal Opportunity Commission, which is given responsibility for overseeing the legislative framework created by this Act, will interpret harm and injury very broadly. So serious injury typically would mean it's almost the furthest along the spectrum of injury legally that you can have, then injury, and then harm. Those are typically the three definitions within the criminal scale of harm. But they are broadly defined, I think, intentionally as well. And it's also worth noting that the definition of what constitutes a change or suppression practice explicitly includes essentially prayer, which I know if you have listeners listening live or to this recording subsequently, will probably find quite distressing to consider. And I think I do want to acknowledge that while obviously, we don't want to view these things always with emotion when we're trying to understand them. It does feel, and I think it would be fair to categorize it as an attack on a certain aspect of expression of religious freedom.
So you can go to prison for praying for someone. Is that accurate?
So, well, according to the Act, if you engage in a practice directed towards a person with or without the person's consent, so you may actually be engaging in conduct consensually with a member of your faith or congregation, and nonetheless be found guilty of engaging in change or suppression practice causing harm under the Act. And I think that in itself really is very concerning. But one thing I wanted to mention at this point, when I talk about change or suppression practice, and I'll get into the definitions that are found in the Act in a moment, I'll go through them briefly. But the people drafting this bill were so conscious of the fact that what they were describing, flipped to the other side of the coin, would perfectly describe services offered by the government, encouraged by the government, encouraged by advocates of gender equality and sexual transition and so on, would fit the definition of change or suppression practice perfectly, if not protected by the bill. So the bill both makes certain types of behavior illegal, but then shields the opponents of religious faith that oppose this from the impact of the bill. So it's a very Orwellian piece of legislation, because in order to exist, it has to acknowledge and defend against the very accurate accusation that it is trying to have it both ways, and it is trying to make an offence behaviour that, if described on the face of it, would meet the criteria of change or suppression practice by its own services. So when I say that, just to clarify.
Okay. So in other words, you're allowed to you're allowed to encourage someone to convert from, say, a religion or to.
Yeah. So so basically, if you are engaging in a practice that is encouraging somebody to transition their gender, to express their sexual preference, or come out as gay, or whatever else, then inducing that person or encouraging that person or providing services to support that would otherwise be caught under the definition of change or suppression in the Act, but for the inclusion of provisions to shield that. So essentially, if you just looked at the definition of change or suppression practice, then that would capture both sides of the spectrum, whereas the Act doesn't want to look at both sides of the spectrum and create an even playing field. It wants to specifically criminalize faith-based views on that, essentially. So the Act specifically protects people engaging in practice that affirms or supports people's decisions to change their gender or express their gender identity and all this kind of thing, but then subsequently defines a practice including psychiatry, religious practice, including but not limited to a prayer-based practice, a deliverance practice, or an exorcism. So that's the clause itself. It also criminalizes giving a person a referral to any practice that would be described as a change or suppression practice. So you don't even have to engage in this conduct to be guilty of an offence. You are also guilty of an offence if you engage in criminalised behaviour outside of Victoria. So there's extrajudicial, extraterritorial applications to this act. So in your opening, when you're talking about people from outside Australia listening to this stream, in actual fact, if you live in the region, for example, in the Pacific Islands, and you host people who are engaging in this kind of behaviour, who live in Victoria, who are engaging in a prayer-based practice for this kind of conduct, then you as the person hosting them, were you to come to Victoria, could be charged. You as the people who live in Victoria could nonetheless be charged under the Act for engaging in the conduct elsewhere, if the effect of the conduct was predominantly in Victoria. So it's a very, very wide-ranging, broad-based set of offences.
It's a wonder they can't do that kind of thing against things that are more serious crimes. But anyway, all right. I want to. You mentioned exorcisms, and I do want to tie in here the Book of Acts, Acts 16, 25 to 34. I'll read that. Acts 16, 25 to 34, and then I've got a question for you. So Acts 16, 25 to 34. But at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were loosed. All right, so this is a reference to some of God's followers who were in prison, and you might wonder, well, how they get there, right? Well, in 16 and 17, the Bible says, "Now it happened as we went to prayer that a certain slave girl, possessed with a spirit of divination, met us, who brought her masters much profit by fortune telling. This girl followed Paul and us and cried out, saying, 'These men are the servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation.' And this she did for many days, but Paul, greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, 'I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her.' And she came out that very hour. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. And then they brought them to the magistrates and said, 'These men, being Jews, exceedingly trouble our city, and they teach customs which are not lawful for us, being Romans, to receive or observe.' And then they were beaten and thrown in prison, right? So what does it say about a society? What kind of society does those kinds of things, where it puts people in prison for, what? I mean, something that wasn't, I suppose we would believe that Paul actually cast a demon out of this girl, right? And her life was improved by that. Maybe someone who doesn't believe. At
the very least, I think someone reading that story wouldn't believe that there was any harm done to the girl or society as a result of that.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to go to. Yeah, exactly. So what sort of society does that? You mentioned the Romans before, so.
Yeah, well, I did. That's right. And I think the things that the Romans criminalised very much reflected, and this is true to this day of governments, the things that governments criminalise are a very good window into the things that governments fear. And that is probably, it's a bit of a cryptic answer, I suppose.
I hear where you're going with this. Okay.
Yeah, you can kind of take from that what you will, but I think
therefore they criminalized it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Romans in the province of Judea in the time of Jesus were terrified of Jewish insurrection. So essentially, anything that seemed to promote alternatives to the Roman state religion, anything that seemed to promote an alternative power center to the praetorship and the governorship of Judea, and essentially the collusive Jewish regime at the time, the Pharisees, anything that seemed to promote an alternative power center or an alternative belief system to that was criminalized. And I think if you take it into the modern age and ask yourself the question, what might the government or the ideology that holds sway in the government of the day fear about people's freedom to religious practice, I think you would have to concede that there is a decreasing tolerance for differences of view. And I think the ideological bent of this government and many governments that I would characterize as progressive or left in thought is that for their beliefs to be consistent and true, there can be no reasonable disagreement. There can be no alternative that isn't ill-founded, malicious, or ignorant. That, you know, there is no scope anymore for reasonable people to disagree on a matter. And I think the language of this bill, and I'll go into the proposed reforms to the Equal Opportunity Act and the federal counter to them a little later in our chat, but you know, I think what they are seeking to do is to reframe the debate by changing the language, by changing the definitions that we begin from, because language shapes thought a lot of the time. And I think by seeking to prevent alternative conversations or differing views from taking place in the public arena and even increasingly now inside faith congregations, inside homes, you know, essentially you could argue that the government is trying to eliminate thought opposition.
Yeah. So there's 2 points that I'm really taking from what you're saying here, and let me know, you know, if I'm getting it right. The first one is that it's not just in our imagination some sort of persecution complex, that there is actually a growing amount of limitation on Christian faith and maybe other faiths, but I don't know about that. But Christian faith in this country and maybe other countries. And that secondly, you're saying it's actually because we're a threat somehow. Like the those who are doing the persecuting feel threatened by us.
In an intellectual sense, I suspect so. And obviously, you know, I should have said at the outset of this too, when we come to discussing legislation and stuff, that I'm not a qualified lawyer, and anyone listening to this should seek independent legal advice about any of the matters that I'm talking about. Sorry, there's my you know political ad spoken in very quick thing right at the end. But I think, as to your first point, I think that it used to be the case, and in Australia, because we don't have strong constitutional or rights-based protections for religious freedom, religion in Australia has relied on many shared societal assumptions and values. Australia does have a very Protestant history in the sense of post-settlement Australia. Obviously, many convicts and early settlers of Australia were Scottish, Irish, and British, and did bring with them ideas about the separation of state and church. But those ideas are not really found in our constitution. The protection or the separation is, but the protection isn't. And I think increasingly the mindset is changing from let's leave spaces for people to disagree or believe what they will, and keep that separation between state and faith. And I think that assumption is increasingly being challenged, and the tolerance for spaces where people can express an alternative view or disagree with the prevailing ideology are being actively lessened. I think you can see, and I'll get into it a little bit later, the way by which this is happening is quite subtle, and it's presented in quite a bad faith way. And I say bad faith to indicate it's framed as a choice, right? So if you have a religious education school, so you might have a school that, for example, I don't know if this.
Let's get into the religious education in a minute, because that does relate to the other law. But let me just say, you've mentioned that subtlety, and I do want to talk a little more about this, because we're often accused as religious people of having some kind of persecution complex, that, you know, we just want to imagine that we're being persecuted because, you know, it makes us think about the glory days, like in this instance in the Book of Acts, where the early church leaders get thrown into prison and it's not their fault, and great things
Well,
happen.
pre-Christian Rome, sent to the lions
Yeah,
and so forth.
and some now people are even trying to say, it wasn't that bad even back in when they were being thrown to the lions. Yeah, but it didn't hurt that much, whatever. I've seen people try to do this. Oh yeah, but they were breaking the law. The law said you had to worship the idols, and they were breaking the law. It's like, okay, so
I think
what does it have?
that might be missing the point in a phenomenal way.
Yeah. Exactly. But no, I wanted to take it back to your personal experience and ask you, what should I expect to find the most challenging thing about going to prison for 2 years? Because let's just try to make this a bit more real. What if I actually was in that situation? What should I be expecting? What would I find the most challenging?
Well, I think in many respects, if yourself or I hope this never happens. I hope it's purely hypothetical. If yourself or one of your congregation or people who were in prison for essentially remaining true to their values, I would suggest that probably in quite a similar fashion to what I experienced, you would actually find it quite easy, because the things that make prison hard as an environment are not the environment. They're the things you take with you in your own mind. And prison is just a microcosm of society. So, nothing happens in prison that doesn't happen in the world outside. It's like living in a town of 200 people where everyone knows each other and everyone's coming around for coffee and, it's gossip.
So and, people, it's just normal life.
literally, and for some people better than their normal life, and that's an unfortunate, that's a completely different conversation about some of the reasons people reoffend. But, my experience was that because I was true to myself, I never pretended to be someone I wasn't. I never tried to be someone other than the person that I am. That was a very different person to the sort of person that a lot of people I was in prison with were used to knowing and experiencing. But because it was just me and I was true to myself, like I'd do the crossword every morning. I was always reading. I was quite focused and determined and set goals and stuff for myself while I was inside. And the reaction I had from guards and other prisoners and stuff wasn't, well, you need to stop doing all that because you're making the rest of us look bad, or you need to conform with, the way our culture is or whatever. They were sort of just like, oh, good for you. It truly, because I was just being true to myself, and I feel that this would be quite an easy thing for you and many of those listening to do. I think the most distressing part of it in this context would obviously be knowing that you are being unjustly persecuted. But as for many early Christians, I suspect they probably found that quite a, by no means an easy experience, but they would have found it easy to endure. And I think there's a difference between a situation being easy and having the resilience and, confidence within your correctness, I guess, or your right-mindedness. I think that would help a lot. So I guess to summarize my answer to your question, relating it back to my own experience, I'm never going to go back to prison, not because prison was particularly hard. Like I've said, for many reasons, I found prison as a structured environment that allowed me to reflect on the mistakes I'd made introspectively, and also in terms of I was able to go back to university and study most of my business degree and make plans and get into the gym. And, for me, prison was not a negative experience in the physical sense, but it's an experience where you are almost cloistered off from the world, and you do feel very apart from the world, and you feel very isolated. You only realize the freedoms you have and when you don't have them. And I think the last 2 years, all this conversation around, COVID's like being in prison and lockdowns are like jail. It's like, no, they're not, because you still have the ability to wake up and chart your own course. You're not being told within your home when you can get up, what you can do. I certainly disagree with many of the policies and the need for the lockdowns as they've happened, but the true experience of being deprived of your liberty is the punishment. That is the punishment. It's not the environment. So
yeah. So that's, I can also think, I don't know, I won't go into maybe what some of the other challenges might be, like reputational damage and your family being looked after and all the rest of it. But still, it's
I think
comforting to know that. But
Yeah,
the
it's funny. It's funny with
freedom
respect to
itself,
that.
yeah, is the freedom itself is something that you miss the most.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, like, with respect to the, I guess, the collateral damage of a criminal record, that my experience of dealing with that is that disclosure and openness is the way to deal with that. And as a result, my consequences have been far less, because I think despite what you might think if you picked up the Herald Sun, just to name a publication, for example, if you picked that up on a given day and read it, you might walk away with a very different view of how Victorians view people with a criminal record, or people who commit offences. But my experience has been that Victorians generally, and Australian culture, is very willing to give people a go, and I think there's a lot of admiration for people who are honestly trying to turn things around and who disclose and are upfront about their past and what they're trying to do. And I think there's a lot of support for that experience and story. I think more than you might be led to believe.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And I think that's, once again, that's a Christian attitude.
It is.
That we should be willing to forgive and willing to let people, back into society.
Well, the capacity for human nature, the capacity for human beings to change and to redeem themselves, and I suppose in a Christian sense, grace and salvation, like that's something that I've been incredibly grateful for.
Yeah. So speaking of being grateful, what aspects of the criminal justice system are you grateful for?
I think the system itself leaves a great deal to be desired. I think there's very wide-ranging reform needed towards, I believe, more personal responsibility and more opportunity for people in prison to begin to rebuild their lives on the outside. I think the justice system is very inward-looking, and it doesn't know what success looks like. I think the only experience that the criminal justice system have of people committing offences is people who reoffend, and they only see the stories of failure and the stories of recidivism.
That floods their view, and there's nothing.
It does.
There's so many reoffenders coming through their system all the time.
Not just that, but there's no voices. And there's no. It's not that they forget about them. There's no voice or narrative for people like me. There's no mainstream advocacy or counter narrative for
a one-off offenders union.
Well, I mean, even people who have had a pattern of recidivism and have really struggled and not gotten it on their first go, have the ability to get out and change their lives. You don't know what point that situation is going to be for people. I personally am familiar with people who have committed multiple offences and gone to prison a couple of times, and then they've just come to a point where they've said, I've had enough. This is just not what I want to do. And they've managed to, get out, get work, turn their lives around. I know people personally who have done the worst thing you can do biblically in secular law and have taken a life. And I know people who have used their 2 decades in prison and parole to turn their life around and learn from that. And that has to be possible. And if nothing else, things I'm grateful for in the justice system are the things that, despite the march of the last 30 years of progressive ideology, have remained at the core, mainly of the courts, mainly of the judiciary, because the judiciary is much less susceptible to the kind of erosion of fundamental rights and liberties and ideas about justice than government and corrections. But I think the inbuilt capacity for people to use the situation they're in to take ownership of their past mistakes and change, that's a part of the justice system that I'm grateful for. I think it persists despite government rather than because of government, but I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's clearly worked in your case. We got a comment from Kim. Enormously insightful conversation. Thank you, Kim. And it is really good to have Jordan here with us, because he's full of knowledge about all sorts of things. And I'm hoping that I'll have him back to talk about this.
Jack of all trades, master of none has been thrown at me before. I don't view that as a criticism. I think we should have more Renaissance men and women.
Soon to be master of one, though, I'm sure.
Well, look, I think master of several, hopefully. But like my studies of the law, law was something that I did as a young man when I was 19 for about 6 months, and then I lost my way and got dragged into law society parties and pills and cocaine and all that stuff that comes with those. And there's many practicing lawyers who engage in that behavior.
Yeah, right.
But for me, with my addictive nature and the struggles and the real, very, very real challenges I had with those things, that led me down a very different path in my 20s. And now being able to revisit something that I thought would be gone to me forever, and learning that even within admission to the law, there is the scope to demonstrate that you are now a fit and proper person, having had criminal offences and having, provided that you are able to explain with full and frank candor what you did, what you learned from it, and what you've done to put that insight into action. So I think it's very rare in this world to find true barriers. I think most of them are untested assumptions.
Yeah, maybe the barriers in our minds in a lot of cases. Although, we're going to move from prison now. We're going to move to the last section as we talk about some other things, which I'm not sure are prisonable sort of offences. I think it's more just you get fines and stuff for breaking these ones. But if you go to prison for something and you feel that was your conviction, then maybe there'll be some people who feel that you're not remorseful enough. But anyway, let's go to the next question. It's a long one. The Victorian government also wants to change the Equal Opportunity Act, so our schools must hire teachers without considering their compatibility with our values. Is that an accurate statement, and is that just?
So I think, the first thing to say is that there hasn't actually been a bill introduced to Parliament yet that I can say with certainty what will appear in the proposed law. As with many things, and I think as the Andrews government modus operandi has been revealed over time, we've now had 6 years, 7 years of government by this current government, and I think what they have shown a tendency to do is to make announcements and make policy by announcement, and they'll put things out to the media to sort of what we call in the politics game to fly kites. They want to see how things go, and they want to test public reaction, and they want to see what things will meet resistance, what things might need to be changed. So some of what they have announced may well not make it to the final bill, but the announcements as made, if we take the announcements on face value, what the announcements do is they seek to amend the Equal Opportunity Act, which currently contains exemptions for religious bodies, including religious schools, to allow religious bodies and schools to discriminate. And even that language in the Equal Opportunity Act, I think, in many ways, set this conversation up, because instead of saying differentiate, because really discrimination is just acknowledging difference. Yeah, and discrimination.
But it sounds bad. We always use the word in a negative way.
If you suggest that someone has a discriminating eye or a discriminating mind, you're actually suggesting a positive thing about them, and that traditionally would have been the usage of the word. But as happens, language is shaped by people who want to use it as a tool, and discrimination now means that if you're acknowledging difference, you are wrong and bad.
You're basically a racist.
Essentially,
you're basically as bad as a racist.
So essentially, the language of discrimination in itself is problematic. But originally, the Equal Opportunity Act had exemptions so that religious organisations were able to differentiate who that they would hire. And the focus on this announcement is schools, but I really want to stress that it does have big implications for congregations as well, because you would probably have an assistant, or you would have lay people assisting you in your work.
Cleaners.
And those people, under these proposed changes, would not fall within the exemptions of the Act. So what they're seeking to do is they're seeking to restrict the exemptions to only roles where the belief system or the religious belief is an inherent requirement of the job. And as someone whose undergraduate
them.
degree was, well, as someone whose undergraduate degree was management and HR, and I know the dark arts of the Fair Work Act and HR, for something to be an inherent requirement of the job, it's defined as something that is essential to performance of the role and the tasks of the role. They don't really care what your preferences are or whether there's alignment or cultural fit or anything like that. You know, if your religious beliefs don't stop you from cleaning floors, then you would not be allowed to differentiate on the cleaners you hire based on their gender identity, belief system, you know, any number of other things that are current.
I guess what you're saying is we can't simply say, look, you know, we've got some work that needs to be done. We'd like one of our church members to do it, rather than just putting it out there. You know, like it's not specifically that we need to have one of our church members do it. It's just we prefer that if you know, because we want to support our members.
Well, I think what it will actually see, and what your comment flags, and this is true of any government intervention, you have government policies that are seeking to create an outcome. And I think in this case, the outcome is they are seeking to, again, make smaller a sphere in which previously there had been greater freedom to exercise discretion and differentiation. They're trying to restrict that sphere only to what they feel they couldn't restrict. I feel that if they felt like they could legislate without gigantic protests and backlash against exercising discrimination in ordainment of ministers and things like that in churches, they would. To be completely honest with you, I think,
like, to be honest,
legally, they probably can. Like legally, they probably can.
I'm pretty sure they could, because
they could, yeah.
According to their reasoning, like, unless you're prepared to actually say that that religion is actually true and it actually makes a difference, whether the person preaching the message believes it or whether, you know, like, if you're coming from a purely utilitarian kind of perspective, then why shouldn't it just be a robot or any different kind of person preaching the message? Isn't it just about, you know, putting out the information of doing the ritual or whatever it is you religious people do? Like, I don't want to get distracted by that, because it's not actually what's being proposed.
No. That's right. But I would stress, particularly with state governments, you know, Australians. And again, I'm conscious we've got limited time, but I feel like this is probably one of the most valuable things your listeners can take away from this conversation. People fixate on the federal government, and in Australia, our federal system has been very hard to understand, and people have always struggled to understand the need for and the relationship between state governments and federal governments. And people get confused by what is within the federal government's power, what is within the states. And this confusion amplifies in areas like education and discrimination law, where lawmaking power is concurrent and it is shared. So, like, trained legal minds find this a challenging area to understand and explain and to navigate. And so it seems bizarre that the average citizen is expected to just understand the way our system works and make informed decisions in elections and so forth, which, you know, is a question for a different day. But essentially, what you have here is a situation where basically this legislation is attempting to restrict one thing. Then if we look at the religious discrimination bill being proposed federally, it is a direct answer to this kind of legislation. So literally... So I'll
switch to that question, and you already answered it, so we're not.
Well, anticipation of the kinds of legislation that state governments are bringing forward, under Labor governments predominantly, but you could make an argument that whoever, but the kinds of legislation that are being proposed, in anticipation of that at a state level, the federal government has for a number of years been talking about introducing religious protections at the federal level. Now, whether or not a federal bill would have the effect of overruling state legislation is very unclear. And the way that our federation works is that in areas of shared lawmaking responsibility, where there is an inconsistency, then to the extent of that inconsistency, federal legislation prevails. But that is the important caveat. And it's not true to say that where there is federal and state legislation, one must trump the other. It's often possible for these laws to overlap one another. And if they can be simultaneously obeyed, they both apply, even if they might, on the face of it, seem to be saying different things. So only where there is a true inconsistency does the federal government legislation prevail, and even then only to the extent of that inconsistency. So it could be one clause out of an entire act that is inconsistent with the Constitution and which overrules a state law, but every other aspect of the state law survives that inconsistency. So, I really need your listeners to understand that if they are hopeful that a federal government intervention will prevent this state government legislation or policy direction, I suspect you would see a very strong state challenge to any federal attempt to do that. And it's not clear at all what the High Court's position on that would be. Historically, the High Court has been very pro-federal powers, and they have granted an ever widening scope of lawmaking power to the federal governments. But in areas like this where, with the equal opportunity amendments that are proposed at the state level, I mentioned before this stream started to you that they're doing it very subtly in some respects, and I echoed that again earlier. What they're saying is not that religious organisations can't continue to enjoy the exemptions as they currently stand. They're saying that if you receive Victorian government funding for education or provision of services, then you do not get to claim these exemptions. So the fruit of the poison tree, right? So,
you either get state government funding or you're basically homeschooling.
So as with vaccine mandates, and I'm conscious that's controversial, and I don't want to get into that area, but they haven't technically told people that they can't work. They've told people that if they want to work in X, Y, or Z industry, they must have this thing.
Well,
and that
if they want very much from home.
Well, this is exactly the thing, and so they're continuing with this method of essentially making it a contra. So they're saying, if you would like to be free to teach or employ or whatever according to religious beliefs, that's fine. Don't do it without funding. And what that is it's a political argument and something that can be run in public to say, well, we're not restricting religious freedoms. We're just putting conditions and attachments on state funding of religious schools. And if religious schools want state funding, well, why are they telling us how we can fund them? So, it's a very cynical, very subtle difference between outrightly...
There's a logic to it.
Yeah, well, there is. I think it's a bit of a perverse logic.
But it's a bit of a mean logic. When it's like this with everything, isn't it? Centrelink or whatever. They gave the money freely in the first place, not putting any conditions on it. And now that they want to put conditions on it, it's our fault if we go bankrupt. Because the thing is that our schools couldn't survive without government funding. No schools can. You're just homeschooling, really. Like it's, you can have a little school, you can make a little school somewhere and have your friends and they can all get together and have school together. But it wouldn't be a proper school in the sense that what's expected of a school today.
Well, I would almost suggest that the response to situations like this, and in my notes for this chat, I kind of was trying to summarize what I think the theme of these things is and what the common threads are, and to sort of, I guess, prompt some thought for your listeners and yourself. And what I came up with is why recourse to the law and the state is a double-edged sword for religious organizations, right?
Yeah.
Because really what it comes down to is nothing is free, and the fruit might be coming from a poison tree, and essentially the point at which you accept the good graces and the support and the resources of the state is the point at which you can sometimes become beholden to them. And it might well be that you would say, well, really, we don't have any other choice. Now we're in this position where expectations of schooling higher and so on. But I would suggest that it wouldn't take a great deal of withdrawal from the schooling system and a return to private or homeschooling in smaller physical spaces, but larger organized online spaces and so on. My personal beliefs I'm a libertarian, but I'm a very sort of specific, some might say radical type of libertarian called Rothbardian libertarian, after Murray Rothbard, who is essentially the founder of what we would call anarcho-capitalism. So he's basically an advocate of no state at all. And I would suggest, as extreme as that sounds, that what we are seeing is the nature of the state and the cost of doing business with the state in many respects. And while it might seem we don't have a choice, if you think creatively and if you look outside the paradigm of what we have been told is necessary and think about what instead is possible, I think the idea of parallel societies and the idea of yourself and your congregation really embracing what can we do for ourselves, what can we do that isn't reliant on government support or government funding. You know, what do we, and it sounds like it's a little bit of a subsistence narrative, I guess, in the sense of not quite cutting off your nose to spite your face, but what I would say is that the less you can depend on the government of the day, the more insulated and protected you are from these kinds of things, which will often be attached or, you know, quid pro quo to provision of government funding or services. So the less you need them, the better, would be my overarching takeaway thought. And I think
it's an inspiring thought, and it's an Adventist thought in my opinion. It's a biblical thought, you know, that we would be dependent on God only, and not on the government. I like that, but maybe you'll have to tell us more about that another time. I got a couple of questions. First, just one, bring it back to faith, and then just want to ask about, you know, where we can find you or whatever. The second last question then is, what is the best idea that Jesus has given to the world, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I would start my answer to that question by saying that my personal relationship with faith and my journey through spirituality has, as you can imagine, with the experiences that I've had, that you've heard about today, has evolved a lot. I think before prison, and, you know, probably caused no small part of my problems, I really had the view that, probably quite hubristically, that, you know, this is all there is and I'm God of my own little universe and whatever. And I think many people in modern society fall into that trap, and it's even encouraged in popular culture and, you know, the way we're marketed to and the way we're taught to believe, and everything's atomized down to the individual, and the individual is their own God. And I think that was certainly where I began my journey. And I think it didn't take me very long in a almost monastic sort of environment that I found prison to be. That was genuinely my experience of it, to kind of reflect and think about that and think, yeah, how'd that work out for you? Probably not so good. So I'm not saying I had a sort of a Saul of Tarsus kind of level moment, but I certainly had an opportunity to sit back and think a bit about my place in things, and some of the things that I think faith has given to our society. And I think we touched on it earlier, but I think I was speaking with my best friend Scott, who is more engaged in active religion than me this morning, and we were saying that it's typical of many of these progressive ideologies and political ideologies that they're very punitive and lacking grace and redemption. And once you err, or once you commit thought crime, or once you wrong the system, then there's no way back. You are branded as that forever. It's a part of who you are. There's this attributive nature to many of modern society's new religions, in a sense. And I think in terms of just that idea that with very few exceptions, nothing you do is so bad that you can't redeem yourself. And the fact that you are able to, there's always hope. Nothing is ever so bad or so hopeless. And I just, if I can share the first couple of weeks, I'd say even the first 6 to 8 weeks that I went to prison, I really was in a state of despair. Like, I was just in like an abyss of emptiness, and I thought, you know, all my life hell would be reoffending and drugs, and, you know, like, it was really a very dark place to be in. But somehow I clung to a core of myself, or I just managed to survive those waves of hopelessness. And then slowly but surely I managed to just, 1 foot at a time, start setting goals for the day, start setting goals for the week. And yeah, I'm not sure I could put a name to what that experience was, or what that sensation was of clinging to that life raft within myself in that sea of hopelessness. But I think that that thought that the sky hasn't fallen in, I'm not dead, the world hasn't stopped turning, life goes on, and, you know, there's always the opportunity to achieve, not even just to redeem yourself from something as serious as what I did, but there's like, why not go out and do the things you might be capable of tomorrow? Why not learn a language? Why not travel? Why not take up something you've always wanted to pursue? You know, the future is infinitely hopeful and possible. And I think, yeah, that would be my answer to that question.
Awesome. Hope. I like it. So, Jordan, before I let you go, and maybe, I don't know if you're comfortable with me to pray for you in a moment, but first, can you just tell us maybe if people want to get in touch with you, if they want to find out more about what you've been sharing, is there anything anywhere that you want to send them?
At the moment, I'm on Facebook. I'm more than happy for anyone to add me. That's my name is as it appears on my StreamYard thing, Jordan Dittloff. I'm on Facebook. I'm more than happy to add anyone that wants to add me. I'm in a bit of a weird time at the moment where I'm sort of like starting to be more open about my experiences, but there's no real, you know, resource. I am in the process of writing a book as well, and that will sort of be stuff that's available. But yeah, basically more than happy for if anyone reaches out to you wanting to get in touch with me, I'm more than happy for you to pass details on and stuff as well. And yeah, hopefully I could even meet some of your congregation in person at some point in the future. So
yeah, that'd be great. Okay, well, Jordan, you happy for me to pray for you?
Yeah, that would be. I need all the prayer and help I can get.
Awesome. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, thank you for Jordan. Thank you that he's been willing to come on our stream and talk to us about some of the stuff that's going on. Lord, thank you for the hope that Jordan gives us, that he reminds us about Jesus and the hope that he gives to the world, and also about the fact that whatever our situation, no matter how dark the place we're in, there is always hope. There is always an opportunity for redemption. And Lord, I thank you also for the hope that he gives us, that we don't need to feel like persecution is something to be feared, but instead let us focus on living the best life we can in you. Lord, I pray for Jordan that for the rest of the things that are going on for him, both today and for the rest of his week and the future. I hope we can talk to him again soon. But Lord, I pray that you would bless him. I pray that you would help him to be able to find the answers that he's looking for his own life, and also for eternity as well. And Lord, I pray all this and a blessing on all those who've been watching, in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, Jordan. Yeah,
no
really
worries.
appreciate it.
Much, guys.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's been great to have you guys tuning in. And I know some will watch afterwards, so thank you for watching afterwards as well. I will try to take a look at some of the comments. We've only had the one from Kim, so thank you, Kim, for the encouragement. But if you do want to comment something afterwards, you have a question for Jordan or something like that, we'll find a way to get that to him. And as I said, you know, if I get anyone else from any of the other sides of this debate replying to me and happy to share their points of view, I'll be happy to interview them as well and try to show the same respect that I've got for Jordan. But really, Jordan, you know, you're someone that I really respect. I think you're a seeker, but I think you're a man with a lot of wisdom and a great future ahead of you. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. All right, bye everyone. We'll see you next time.